Get out. Don't pretend you understand this, janitor. Dr. Olivia Harris's words sliced through the lecture hall like cold steel. Her manicured finger jabbed the air, commanding silence and obedience in equal measure. 30 graduate students looked on, half amused, half terrified. The 35-year-old mathematics prodigy stood poised before a blackboard covered in elegant chaos, equations twisting like constellations of intellect only she believed she could navigate. At the back of the room, Mason Wright froze beside his cleaning cart. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. Every eye was on him. The invisible man suddenly dragged into their world of polished intelligence and unspoken superiority. His grip tightened on the mop handle. He could have walked away. He should have walked away. But something in her tone, something sharp, cruel, dismissive, snapped something inside him. Instead of leaving, Mason stepped closer. The wheels of his cart squeaked against the marble floor, echoing louder than any word. Olivia's confident smirk wavered. For a fleeting moment, she saw something dangerous in his eyes. Focus, calculation, calm rebellion. Actually, Professor, Mason said quietly, his voice steady and deliberate, there's an error in your third line. The room erupted into whispers and muffled laughter. A janitor correcting a Whitmore University professor? Absurd. But Mason didn't flinch. His gaze held the blackboard like it was an old friend. He walked closer, each step deliberate, until he stood where no one dared, beside the woman who ruled this department like a monarch. Olivia's breath hitched as she looked back at the equation. The symbols that had once flowed so beautifully now stared back like mocking hieroglyphs. Her mind replayed the sequence. Third line derivative step, integration constant. He was right. The realization burned through her pride like acid. She masked her shock with a smirk. Lucky guess, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut the tension. But even as the students laughed in nervous relief, her heart was hammering. When Mason returned to his cart and pushed it toward the door, the echo of whispers followed him like a rising tide. The janitor found her mistake. By sunset, the story had spread through Whitmore University's marble halls like wildfire. The janitor who corrected Dr. Olivia Harris, the university's rising mathematical star, was on everyone's lips. In cafeteria corners and faculty lounges, the hierarchy that kept scholars and workers worlds apart had been disturbed by something unthinkable. Proof that genius might wear uniform. Olivia sat in her corner office, surrounded by framed certificates from Harvard, MIT, and Cambridge, each a monument to her unbroken ascent. Yet for the first time in years, her reflection in the glass didn't look invincible. The error Mason spotted wasn't small, it was fundamental. Her credentials gleamed like armor, but somewhere in the seams, doubt was leaking through. Meanwhile, across campus, Mason's shift continued as if nothing had happened. He emptied trash cans, mopped floors, and restocked supplies. But hidden behind the maintenance manuals in his locker were coffee-stained notebooks filled with dense equations, differential models, and pages of impossible beauty, his own mathematical proofs. He wasn't supposed to exist. Not here. Not in a world where knowledge was guarded by gatekeepers and sealed behind tuition fees. But every night, while others slept, Mason studied under the flickering light of the janitor's closet, chasing truth with the quiet ferocity of someone who'd lost too much to give up. Whitmore University prided itself on hierarchy. Students paid $65,000 a year to breathe its rarefied air. Professors like Olivia sat on pedestals of prestige, trading citations and research grants like currency. Maintenance staff, however, remained invisible, background figures in an academic play that was never written for them. Yet somewhere inside those pristine walls, a quiet revolution had begun. Olivia tried to rationalize it. A coincidence, a fluke, a random alignment of logic and luck. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw his handwriting on the board, sharp, disciplined, purposeful. She hated that it haunted her. She hated that, for a brief moment, she'd seen something in him she couldn't define, clarity. The next morning, whispers turned into rumors, and rumors into myth. The janitor who saw what the professor missed. It was the kind of story academia wasn't built to contain. In faculty meetings, Olivia spoke with her usual confidence. discussing research standards and the upcoming Euler's Challenge, a global mathematics competition offering $50,000 and automatic PhD admission to any winner. Her colleagues listened, admiring her precision and poise. None of them saw the tremor in her hand as she adjusted her glasses. None of them knew that her greatest rival might be the man who mopped their floors. But somewhere deep down, Olivia felt something stirring. Fear disguised as curiosity. Who was Mason Wright, and how had he seen what she hadn't? That night, as she gazed out her office window across the manicured lawns, the faint sound of a cleaning cart echoed through the corridor below. The same rhythm that had once irritated her now drew her closer to the glass. The hierarchy at Whitmore had always been unshakable. Until now, and the first crack had already appeared. Whitmore University's corridors gleamed under the polished glow of fluorescent lights. But behind that shine, two very different worlds existed. Dr. Olivia Harris lived in one, the world of polished conferences, quiet prestige, and the unspoken worship of intellect. Her office overlooked manicured lawns where students in designer coats debated theories between sips of overpriced coffee. Each wall was a mirror of her own success. Certificates from Harvard, MIT, Cambridge, and countless journals bearing her name in elegant serif type. She dined with Nobel laureates, her laughter measured, her words carefully sharpened to impress. The other world belonged to Mason Wright. His nights began when Olivia's ended. His tools were not equations or laser pointers, but a mop, a broom, a stack of supplies, and a squeaking metal cart. The same lecture halls that held applause for professors became silent cathedrals he cleaned alone. And yet, somewhere between trash bins and tiled floors, he found something sacred: knowledge. In his locker sat worn textbooks covered in scribbled notes. Their spines were cracked, their pages lined with coffee stains and pencil marks that told the story of a man teaching himself what the world refused to teach him. Topology, nonlinear systems. Hilbert space, he muttered softly while wiping a desk, the equations glinting in his mind like constellations. He wasn't chasing approval. He was chasing truth. While others saw dust, Mason saw patterns. Symmetry in the way light refracted across polished marble, harmony in the geometry of tile floors. His brain didn't rest. It translated everything into equations, an endless map of meaning only he could see. Meanwhile, Olivia's perfect order began to crumble. Every time she lectured, she remembered that single, humiliating correction, the error in her third line. It replayed in her mind like a haunting melody she couldn't silence. The worst part wasn't that Mason had been right. It was that he had understood why she was wrong. At the faculty dinner that week, she laughed a little too loudly, drank a little too much, and argued about the decline of academic rigor with her Harvard boyfriend, Dr. Ethan Brown. "Don't overthink it," Ethan smirked, swirling his glass of wine. "Some janitor caught a lucky break. You'll forget him in a week." But Olivia couldn't forget. In her quiet apartment later that night, she found herself opening her old notebooks, re-examining proofs she hadn't questioned in years. Each symbol whispered the same taunt. How did he see it before you did? She rationalized the event as coincidence, maybe eavesdropping, maybe luck. But her confidence no longer fit as tightly as her tailored suits. Across campus, Mason took a short break in a dimly lit corridor. The hum of vending machines his only company. He opened a small, wrinkled photo of his mother, a woman with tired eyes and an encouraging smile. "One day," he whispered, "I'll prove it was worth it." That night, as snow began to fall outside, the university buzzed with new rumors. Students whispered about the upcoming Euler's Challenge, the competition Olivia was set to judge. The prize wasn't just money, it was validation. And validation was a currency Mason had been denied his entire life. The next morning, Olivia stood before her mirror, adjusting her pearl earrings. She was scheduled to announce the competition in the main auditorium. She rehearsed her speech, crisp, professional, authoritative, the tone of a woman who'd never been wrong. But as she walked past the janitor's closet and saw Mason organizing his supplies, she hesitated. For the briefest second, their eyes met. His calm gaze unnerved her more than any argument ever could. "Good morning, Professor," he said softly, stepping aside to let her pass. She nodded curtly, pretending not to care, but his voice lingered. There was no bitterness in it, no sarcasm, just quiet dignity. Inside the auditorium, Olivia commanded the stage. Rows of students leaned forward as her voice echoed through the hall. "This competition represents the pinnacle of mathematical achievement," she declared. $50,000 and automatic PhD admission await those with true intellectual depth. Her words soared, polished and perfect, until a student raised his hand. "Professor, can all university staff enter the competition?" Olivia's practiced smile returned, sharp and deliberate. "Technically, yes," she said sweetly, her eyes finding Mason near the back as he paused during his cleaning round. "But advanced mathematics requires years of formal training. We wouldn't want anyone embarrassing themselves publicly." The audience chuckled. Mason said nothing. "Let me demonstrate the level of sophistication required," she continued, turning to the board. Chalk scratched across the surface as she wrote a seemingly simple calculus problem that had a complex trap of trigonometric identities. Students bent over notebooks, racing through substitutions and integration by parts. Olivia walked among them like a queen inspecting her knights. "Excellent work," she said finally, glancing at the neat answers appearing across the room. "This represents the minimum standard for intellectual maturity." She reached for the eraser and paused when Mason's quiet voice broke the silence. "Professor Harris," he said, "there's a more elegant approach, using symmetry." The air froze. Every student looked up. Olivia's hand hovered midair, her pulse spiking. "Oh, really?" she said coolly, masking her unease. "Please enlighten us." Mason stepped forward, his uniform dark against the bright stage lights. He picked up the chalk. His handwriting, crisp, balanced, methodical, drew the problem into a graceful dance of logic and geometry. "By recognizing mirror symmetry," he said, "we can transform this into a simpler form." Same answer, half the work. For a moment, the room forgot who he was. Even Olivia did. It wasn't janitor or professor. It was mathematician to mathematician. When he set the chalk down, the solution glowed like a quiet masterpiece. A few students began to clap before her glare silenced them. Olivia's jaw tightened. Something inside her trembled, admiration, envy, and something else she didn't dare name. "Impressive," she said coldly. "But mathematics isn't about shortcuts. It's about rigor." Her pride forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then, in a surge of arrogance and something dangerously close to traction, she wrote a new equation, a brutal differential system from her doctoral research. "Fine," she said, turning to him, her voice cutting through the crowd. "If you think you're so gifted, solve this equation, and I'll marry you." Laughter erupted, cruel and mocking. But Mason didn't smile. He simply looked at the equation, studied it, then picked up the chalk again. And what happened next silenced the entire auditorium. The laughter faded into uneasy silence as Mason Wright approached the board, the chalk trembling lightly between his fingers. But his eyes, they were steady, burning with quiet fire. Dr. Olivia Harris leaned against her desk, arms crossed, waiting for his humiliation to unfold before the amused crowd of graduate students. The problem she'd written was no ordinary equation. It was a monster, a nonlinear differential system she herself had labored over for weeks during her PhD. It had taken her sleepless nights, black coffee, and consultations with multiple advisors to find a solution. This was her domain, her kingdom of symbols and logic, and now she'd thrown the gates open to a janitor, certain he would crumble. Mason stared at the chalkboard for a long, motionless moment. The air grew heavy. Then, without a word, he began to write, slowly at first, then with rhythm. Each symbol flowed into the next, lines bending into perfect balance. Every stroke was confident, deliberate, as if the mathematics were speaking through him. The sound of chalk scratching filled the room like soft percussion. His method wasn't brute computation. It was elegance in motion. He paused briefly, turned, and spoke in a calm, low voice that carried across the hall. "The key," he said, "is to reduce the second-order term using boundary symmetry. Once it collapses, the integral converges naturally." Olivia blinked. "What?" That was the very insight she had missed the first time she'd encountered the problem herself. Gasps rippled across the hall as his proof unfolded. Clean, fluid, beautiful. 5 minutes later, Mason stepped back, his shirt collar damp with sweat, but his eyes filled with quiet triumph. "The solution checks out," he said softly. "Would you like me to verify the boundary conditions, Professor?" The silence that followed was deafening. Every student in the room knew what they had just witnessed. A man solving a research-level problem on the spot, in front of its own creator. Olivia's pulse thundered in her ears. She moved closer, scanning the solution line by line, searching for a flaw, anything to dismiss him. But there was none. Every step was perfect, every variable aligned. The realization hit her like lightning. He was right again. Whispers exploded into full-blown murmurs. Phones came out. Students were recording, live tweeting, sharing what would soon become one of Whitmore University's most viral moments. Her voice cracked slightly as she forced words out. "One problem doesn't prove mathematical maturity," she said, though the tremor betrayed her disbelief. Anyone can memorize a technique. But she couldn't look away. Mason's solution wasn't memorized. It was understood. He hadn't copied a pattern. He had seen through the problem itself, stripping it bare. At the back of the room, a visiting scholar, Dr. Grace Walker from Stanford, had been observing quietly, arms folded, her brows lifted in astonishment. When Mason set down the chalk, she stepped forward. That, she said clearly, was mathematically brilliant, elegant and rigorous. The crowd erupted again, phones flashing, whispers merging into stunned applause. Olivia's skin prickled with humiliation. Having another professor praise the janitor was salt on an open wound. Her pride screamed to reassert control. "Well then," she said, her tone icy, "perhaps Mr. Wright would like to test his genius in the Oilers Challenge next week." She turned to the audience. "It's an international competition. $50,000 and automatic PhD admission await the winner." Her eyes flicked to Mason. "But do remember, when you fail, I try to spare you the embarrassment." Her words were measured, but the threat beneath them was unmistakable. Mason didn't flinch. "Thank you, Professor," he said quietly. "I'll enter." And in that instant, something shifted. The students no longer saw a janitor. They saw a challenger, an outsider defying the structure they'd been taught to worship. Within hours, the clip of Mason solving the equation flooded social media. "Janitor School's Professor Live on Stage," read one headline. Another captioned it, "Solve this equation, and I'll marry you," and he did. The story spread beyond Whitmore's marble walls, reaching faculty groups, mathematical forums, and university blogs across the world. The video's view count climbed into the millions overnight. By morning, everyone on campus knew Mason's name. Olivia Harris, however, wasn't celebrating. Behind her office door, she paced furiously. Her phone buzzed with messages, colleagues, reporters, even Dr. Ethan Brown from Harvard. "Catherine," he began, catching himself. "Olivia, you're making yourself a spectacle. You let a janitor humiliate you. Fix this before the department becomes a joke." But how could she? He hadn't cheated. He hadn't tricked her. He'd simply seen the solution. As night fell, she stared at her reflection in the window, the reflection of a woman who had built her life on being the smartest person in every room. For the first time, that foundation trembled. Across campus, Mason sat alone in the maintenance room, flipping through his notes beneath a flickering bulb. On the wall beside him, someone had taped a screenshot of the viral post, his name underlined in red. He smiled faintly, not from pride, but from relief. All he had wanted was to belong. The next morning, Whitmore's bulletin boards displayed the Oilers Challenge registration poster, official, grand, and intimidating. In bold letters at the bottom read, "Head Judge, Dr. Olivia Harris." Fate, it seemed, had drawn its line on the chalkboard, but this time both of them were holding the chalk, and only one equation would decide who was truly worthy. 3 days later, the auditorium pulsed with anticipation. The banner for the Oilers Challenge stretched across the stage, a symbol of mathematical glory and academic prestige. Cameras lined the aisles. The media had turned the event into a spectacle. Everyone wanted to see the janitor, who dared to challenge the Queen of Whitmore. Dr. Olivia Harris stood at the podium, the epitome of composure. Her tailored navy suit gleamed under the stage lights, her posture flawless. Yet behind that calm mask, her thoughts were a storm. Every conversation she'd had since the incident had been shadowed by pity or curiosity. She could feel it in the way her colleagues avoided her eyes, as if her authority had been reduced to a viral joke. "Welcome," she began, voice strong, commanding. "The Euler's Challenge celebrates the pinnacle of mathematical excellence. $50,000 in automatic PhD admission await the mind capable of true innovation." Her gaze swept across the contestants, 12 in total. Harvard, MIT, Yale, Stanford. Each name tag was a badge of privilege. And then at the end of the row stood Mason Wright. His nameplate didn't list a university. Just one word: maintenance. The crowd murmured. Some smirked. Some whispered prayers for his failure. Mason adjusted his plain uniform and met Olivia's gaze with quiet defiance. The first round began. The problem flashed across the main screen. Prove that adding the first few odd numbers always gives a perfect square. It was deceptively simple, a warm-up designed to let real mathematicians flex before the world. Olivia knew Mason would be eliminated quickly. One by one, contestants filled their whiteboards with elegant algebraic proofs. Rigor, logic, precision, all exactly as expected. Olivia smiled faintly. This is the order of things. Then she turned toward Mason's board and froze. Instead of equations, he was drawing. Dots. Rows of them. He arranged them into patterns, 1, 3, 5, 7, each forming a perfect square as the sequence grew. The audience leaned forward, puzzled, and then realization dawned. He was proving the theorem visually. "Look," Mason said, turning to the audience, voice steady. "Mathematics isn't just about calculation. It's about seeing. Each odd number adds a new layer to the square. The pattern itself proves the truth." On the screen, his diagram glowed like an artist's signature, breathtaking in its simplicity, a perfect visual representation of algebraic truth. For a heartbeat, the auditorium was silent. Then, applause erupted like thunder. Olivia's smile faltered. Her chest tightened with disbelief. The other judges exchanged astonished glances. Even Dr. Grace Walker leaned forward, whispering, "That's extraordinary." "He's showing the beauty behind the logic," one student said aloud. Olivia clenched her jaw. "Creative, yes," she said, forcing composure. "But formal mathematics demands rigor. Pictures can't replace proofs." But the crowd wasn't listening. They had seen genius, raw, intuitive, and unpretentious. When the results were announced, all 12 contestants advanced. But everyone knew who the real star was. By the next morning, social media had given Mason a new title, the Janitor Genius. Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Math Miracle. Hashtag Sterling versus Janitor. Hashtag The Equation of Pride. Mathematicians debated his methods online, while students shared clips of his visual proof under captions like, "I finally understand math for the first time." Inside her office, Olivia scrolled through the comments with trembling hands. Every word stabbed at her ego. "He explains better than the professors." "Harris looks jealous." "He's changing how we see intelligence." Her phone buzzed again. Ethan Brown, the Harvard mathematician she'd once dated. "Olivia, you've lost control of the narrative. You're turning academia into a circus. For your own sake, put the janitor in his place. Show the world why credentials exist." She hung up without answering. Later that afternoon, as the auditorium emptied for break, Dr. Walker approached her, eyes full of concern. "Catherine," she stopped herself. "Olivia, this competition feels personal. You're not testing mathematics anymore. You're testing him." Olivia's lips tightened. "I'm upholding standards," she replied coolly. "If he wins, what happens to the meaning of education itself?" Grace hesitated, then nodded softly. "Maybe it evolves." That night, as snow fell against the campus windows, Mason studied under the dim light of the janitor's office. surrounded by old textbooks and printouts of past challenges. He had made it to the semifinals, but fatigue weighed heavy. His shift was long, his breaks short, each equation blurred as exhaustion crept in. Meanwhile, Olivia sat in her high-rise apartment, surrounded by silence and city light. For the first time in years, she felt small. Her success had always depended on being the smartest person in the room. But now she wasn't sure that title belonged to her anymore. Tomorrow's challenge would change everything. When the dawn broke over Whitmore, the auditorium filled again, twice as crowded as before. TV cameras, reporters, and university board members took their seats. The buzz of the crowd hummed like electricity. Olivia stepped onto the stage and announced the semifinal challenge. "Today," she said, voice crisp, "we separate intuition from true academic mastery." The problem flashed on screen. A graduate-level analysis question involving convergence and infinite series. The crowd gasped at its complexity. Mason stared at it. The words looked like another language. Olivia's heart swelled with satisfaction. This was her domain again. "Let's see what happens," she murmured under her breath. But as the clock started, something remarkable happened. While others scribbled furiously, Mason closed his eyes, breathing deeply. He wasn't solving the equations. He was feeling them, picturing the motion of numbers, the balance of infinity. He began to draw again, mapping the pattern as a graph of bouncing curves. "Think of it like a ball," he said aloud. "Each bounce smaller than the last, until it settles." His voice reached the audience, clear and calm. "If the motion stops, the series converges. If not, it diverges. The math simply tells us which one happens." The room leaned forward, mesmerized. Even Olivia forgot to breathe. For a fleeting moment, she wasn't his enemy. She was a witness to something pure. And when he finished, the hall erupted again. Dr. Walker rose to her feet. "Extraordinary," she said. "That's not just mathematics. That's understanding." Olivia sat frozen as applause thundered around her. He had just turned her own competition into his classroom. By the time the semifinals ended, the world was watching. The Oilers' challenge had become more than a competition. It was a symbol, a battlefield between privilege and possibility. And at its center stood a janitor who refused to know his place. The three finalists were announced beneath a storm of applause. Chloe Allen, Olivia's protege and Whitmore's pride. Nolan Davis, Harvard's golden student. And Mason Wright, the man who swept the floors but had somehow swept the world's imagination along with them. International viewership soared past 70,000. Professors debated his performance on live broadcasts. Students waved handwritten signs, "Go Mason," and brains over titles. But not everyone was cheering. That evening, while the campus celebrated, Mason was questioned by security. They had received a complaint about his after-hours use of the library. The chief's tone was cold, rehearsed. "Maintenance personnel are not authorized to use academic facilities unsupervised. Please stick to your designated areas." Mason said nothing. He knew who had filed the complaint. When he returned to the janitor's room, he found his textbooks dumped on the floor. Torn pages fluttered like wounded wings. His heart sank, but not from anger, from exhaustion. He looked at the security camera blinking in the corner. Somewhere out there, online viewers who had hacked into the university's feed were still watching him. "He's studying again," someone typed in the chat. "He's teaching himself graduate-level math overnight. This is insane." They were right. It was insane, but it was all he had left. Meanwhile, in her glass-walled apartment, Dr. Olivia Harris poured herself another drink and stared at her reflection. For the first time, she couldn't tell whether the tremor in her hand was anger or guilt. She should have felt victorious. Tomorrow's final would be her triumph. She had designed the ultimate test, one that even she had struggled to solve years ago. Mason wouldn't stand a chance. But beneath the veneer of pride, a question haunted her. What if he did it again? At 2 a.m., Mason sat in the library, surrounded by open books. The equation ahead of him blurred with fatigue. He rubbed his eyes and whispered to himself, "It's all the same language, just deeper." Slowly, patterns began to emerge. Complex functions folded into simpler truths. The architecture of the universe was starting to make sense to him, piece by piece, line by line. The next morning, he arrived for work early, eyes bloodshot, uniform wrinkled, mind wired with determination. He'd only slept 2 hours, but he didn't care. Outside, camera vans lined the campus. Reporters camped by the auditorium doors. Inside, professors adjusted microphones and bright lights shimmered against polished floors. The final challenge would decide everything. Before it began, Dr. Grace Walker approached Olivia. "Catherine," she corrected herself again. "Olivia, this round, it's too harsh. The problem you prepared, it's not a fair test." Olivia's tone was ice. "Mathematics doesn't need fairness. It needs truth." Grace frowned. There's a difference between rigor and cruelty. But Olivia turned away before she could answer. Backstage, Mason was greeted by Nolan and Chloe, both surprisingly calm. "I've got to admit," Nolan said quietly, "you've taught us something no class ever did." Chloe nodded. "You see things differently. You make the rest of us actually feel math." Mason smiled faintly. "It's not mine. It's everyone's. We just forgot how to see it." Minutes later, the lights dimmed. The audience hushed. Olivia stepped onto the stage, immaculate as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "today we determine true mathematical excellence. Each finalist will face the most rigorous test ever attempted in this competition. The winner will be the one who can not only solve but defend their approach." Her eyes found Mason in the crowd, tired, humble, and unshaken. The screen flickered to life. The problem appeared. Mason's heart dropped. He recognized it instantly. It was Olivia's own doctoral research, the kind of problem that took years of guided study to master. The ultimate trap. Around him, murmurs rose. "That's not fair," whispered someone from the judge's table. "That's her own thesis." Grace Walker's face darkened. "Olivia, this isn't a challenge. It's sabotage." But Olivia only smiled. Excellence demands no compromises. The timer began to tick. 90 minutes. 3 competitors. 1 impossible problem. Mason stared at the board, frozen. His knowledge stopped at the gates of her equation. The symbols swirled in his vision, foreign and unforgiving. He tried one approach, then another, each collapsing into confusion. Olivia's voice echoed faintly into the microphone for the audience at home. "We're witnessing the limits of self-education," she said. "Genius without structure is chaos." By the halfway mark, Mason's board was covered in crossed-out equations. Sweat trickled down his temple. He made a crucial error and had to erase everything. The audience murmured, uncomfortable. The comments on the live stream turned cruel. "He's lost it. See? This is why credentials matter." Olivia was right. At minute 60, Mason stopped writing altogether. He stood, staring at the board, chalk trembling in his hand. Dr. Harris's voice sliced through the silence. "Perhaps we should allow struggling participants to withdraw gracefully. There's no shame in admitting one's limits." Her words hit like a dagger. Cameras zoomed in on Mason's face, the very image of defeat. Then something shifted. A voice cut through the noise. Dr. Walker's. "I'd like to remind everyone," she said firmly, "that mathematical history is full of minds who broke convention to find new truths. Sometimes the greatest discoveries come from those the system overlooks." Her words hung in the air, and something inside Mason clicked. A long-buried memory from his unfinished graduate years surfaced. A simpler method he'd once studied, one that might bypass all the modern theory Olivia was counting on. His heart began to race. He closed his eyes, breathed once, then turned back to the board. With 15 minutes left, he picked up the chalk again. He wasn't trying to beat her anymore. He was trying to remember why he loved this. And that's when everything began to change. The auditorium had become a pressure cooker of silence. Only the steady tick of the timer broke the stillness. With 15 minutes left, Mason Wright stood alone before a wall of erased chalk and fading confidence. Sweat clung to his collar. The lights were hot. The world was watching. Over 100,000 viewers on the live stream, and every one of them waiting for him to fail. He took one slow breath, eyes closed, mind searching for clarity. Then Dr. Grace Walker's words replayed in his head. The greatest discoveries come from those the system overlooks. Something clicked. Mason opened his eyes, grabbed the chalk, and began again, but this time he didn't follow Olivia's path. He didn't mimic the methods of modern mathematicians. He went back to the beginning. Instead of relying on advanced operator theory or functional analysis, Mason reached for the old masters, the classical variational methods from centuries ago, the kind taught in dusty books long before computers and modern jargon. At first, the judges exchanged confused looks. The crowd whispered, "He's using the wrong approach," someone muttered. "That's not how this kind of problem works." But Mason wasn't listening. His hand moved faster now, guided by something deeper than memory, intuition. He simplified the equation, reframed it, treated it as a problem of energy minimization. To him, the symbols weren't just numbers. They were the movement of forces, the balance of tension, the flow of nature itself. His chalk flew across the board, every stroke deliberate, every equation a counterpoint to Olivia's own methods. Dr. Walker leaned forward, eyes wide. "He's not following her technique," she whispered. "He's rewriting the entire approach." Olivia's throat tightened. Her grip on the table whitened. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to collapse, not rebuild mathematics in front of her. At the 10-minute mark, the auditorium began to stir. The judges moved closer, whispering to one another. A few professors began taking photos of the board. Even those who had mocked him earlier fell silent, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Mason's movements grew more confident. He worked with clarity that bordered on divine precision. He wasn't just solving the equation. He was teaching it, showing the crowd how truth unfolded when stripped of pretense. "Mathematics," he said quietly, "isn't about power. It's about seeing what others overlook." His final line curved elegantly across the board, the completed solution, radiant in its simplicity. He set the chalk down. Done. The timer froze at 1 minute and 12 seconds remaining. Gasps echoed through the hall. The screen flashed with his work, the whiteboard now a cathedral of pure logic. Dr. Harris, Olivia, rose slowly from her chair. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She studied his work, expecting to find errors, shortcuts, cracks in the logic. But there were none. Every step was mathematically sound. His approach bypassed 3 years of her doctoral agony with classical beauty she had dismissed as obsolete. Her voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. Impossible. Dr. Walker stood and motioned to the other judges. "We'll verify his work." For 15 long minutes, the 3 judges checked his reasoning line by line. The audience sat frozen. The live stream chat exploded. "He's cracked it. This is history." A janitor just solved a PhD-level problem using 19th century math. Finally, Dr. Walker turned back to microphone, her voice trembling with awe. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "Mr. Wright's solution is mathematically rigorous, complete, and, in its simplicity, breathtaking." The auditorium exploded. Applause thundered like an earthquake. People stood, cheered, cried. Olivia sat motionless. Her empire was falling around her. The man she had mocked now stood at the center of the stage, victorious, composed, and radiant in the humility of his genius. Still, she tried one last offense. Her voice cut through the applause, brittle but desperate. "This approach ignores critical details, regularity theory, Sobolev embeddings." Mason turned, his expression calm. "Those methods are powerful, Professor, but not always necessary. I've demonstrated that simpler paths can reach the same truth. Mathematics doesn't belong to complexity. It belongs to understanding." The crowd erupted again, the applause deafening this time. Somewhere among the chaos, a voice from the audience shouted, "So when's the wedding, Professor?" Laughter rippled through the room. Olivia's face flushed crimson. The word she had once used to humiliate him now returned as poetic justice before millions of viewers. Mason smiled slightly, then stepped to the microphone. "Mathematics brought us together today," he said softly. "And maybe it can remind us that truth doesn't care who's holding the chalk." The applause roared again, but as it subsided, Dr. Walker raised her hand for silence. Her expression was serious, almost haunted. Before we conclude, she said slowly, I have something important to share. The crowd quieted instantly. Olivia turned toward her, confused. Walker continued, all day, I've had this strange sense of familiarity watching Mr. Wright work, his techniques, his reasoning, even his handwriting. It reminded me of a doctoral student I once supervised years ago at MIT. Olivia's stomach dropped. What are you saying? She asked, her voice barely audible. Grace's gaze moved to Mason. Mr. Wright isn't who you think he is. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a worn MIT folder. Mason Wright completed his PhD coursework under my supervision 7 years ago. Highest distinction. Published papers. Sloan Research Fellow. He withdrew only to care for his mother during cancer treatment. The room froze. Olivia's heart stopped. The crowd erupted in disbelief. Gasps, murmurs, flashes. The story twisted instantly into something far bigger than anyone imagined. The janitor wasn't an uneducated miracle. He was a brilliant academic who'd sacrificed everything for love and family, and whom the system had quietly discarded. The live stream chat exploded again. MIT. He was a doctoral student. She humiliated her own equal. Olivia's face went pale. Every arrogant word, every insult, every act of cruelty she had dealt and replayed in her mind. Now, under a light she could never escape. She had mocked him, judged him, dismissed him, and all along he'd been her superior. The auditorium trembled with history being rewritten before their eyes. When the thunder of applause faded, only the sound of camera shutters remained. The stage lights dimmed to a golden glow, bathing the moment in quiet reverence. Dr. Grace Walker stood at the microphone, her voice heavy with the weight of truth. Mr. Mason Wright, she said softly, was once one of my brightest doctoral students at MIT. His record speaks for itself. Top of his class, published work, Sloan Fellowship recipient. He left not because he failed, but because his mother was dying. A stunned silence gripped the room. Then came a ripple of gas as realization sank in. The man they called the janitor genius wasn't an outsider at all. He was proof that brilliance doesn't vanish when stripped of title. Olivia Harris sat frozen, her mind spinning through every cruel word she'd spoken, every condescending glance. Around her, the audience began to applaud again, not for spectacle this time, but for recognition. Truth had prevailed. On the stage, Mason's expression remained humble. I didn't want this story to be about me, he said quietly. I just wanted to remind people that talent isn't something institutions create. It's something they often overlook. The judges approached him one by one, shaking his hand, congratulating him. Dr. Walker smiled proudly, her eyes glistening. You've done more for mathematics today than any of us expected, she whispered. But across the stage, Olivia could barely meet his eyes. The humiliation burned deeper than any wound. Not because she'd lost, but because she'd been wrong. Everything she had believed about intelligence, class, and worth had shattered in front of a global audience. After the cameras stopped rolling, and the hall emptied, only 2 people remained. Mason stood near the board, the faint smell of chalk still in the air. Olivia sat in the front row, staring at the whiteboard that had dismantled her pride. He approached quietly. You should go home, Professor, he said gently. She looked up, tears in her eyes. I owe you more than an apology, she whispered. I owe you acknowledgement and respect. I let arrogance blind me. You didn't just challenge my equations, you exposed my ignorance. Mason smiled faintly. You're not the first person to judge by appearances, but maybe you're the first to admit it. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was healing. Years of division condensed into a single moment of understanding. Olivia swallowed, her voice trembling. About my ridiculous marriage challenge. Mason chuckled softly. You mean the one that broke the internet? Her cheeks flushed. Yes, that one. I didn't mean it, but maybe I do now. I mean, not literally. She stopped herself, laughing through her tears. I just mean I'd like to start over. As equals. Maybe dinner first. Mason nodded. Dinner sounds good. but only if I get to choose the restaurant. She smiled the first time, a real smile, unguarded, human. 6 months later, headlines across academia told the story the world couldn't stop talking about. Dr. Mason Wright returned to MIT to complete his Ph.D., appointed visiting researcher at Whitmore University. Beside it, another article read, Professor Harris launches scholarship for hidden talent. Inspired by the janitor who changed her life. They didn't need to explain the rest. The photo said it all. Olivia and Mason walking side by side across Whitmore's campus, both carrying books, both laughing. Equals in love and intellect. Their story sparked something far beyond Whitmore's marble walls. Universities across the country began reviewing their hiring practices. Social media movements encouraged people to look beyond uniforms and job titles. Countless stories surfaced. Hidden minds, forgotten talents, quiet geniuses waiting for a chance. And as the credits rolled on this unlikely love story, Mason's voice returned in the narration that had started it all. Intelligence doesn't wear a uniform. Brilliance doesn't require a pedigree. Love doesn't obey hierarchies. So, the next time you meet someone, don't judge their story by their job title. You might be standing in front of the smartest person you'll ever know. He paused. Or the one who'll teach you what love really means. The screen faded to black, leaving only the echo of applause and the hum of possibility. The sound of a world changed by one man, one woman, and one impossible equation. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoyed today's story, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another pulse-pounding cinematic tale from Black Rise. Here's a quick question for you. If someone you once underestimated turned out to be your greatest teacher, would you have the humility to start again? Sometimes forgiveness is the hardest equation we ever solve.